This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin this week's programming with our cattle market update. This week, we are joined by Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz. He shares that the markets took somewhat of a breathing period after several weeks of strong movement. He also highlights two recently released USDA reports, April's cattle on feed and the 2022 Livestock Slaughter Annual Summary. The show continues with K-State Farm Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti. Ignacio shared insight on soybean planting considerations last week and joins us today to highlight this year's corn crop. The K-State specialist emphasizes again the lack of water in our soils and the importance of adjusting seeding rates. For our wildlife segment this week, we are joined by K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew ends today's show by discussing management strategies for forest rehabilitation. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz for this week's cattle market update. Lee, before we get into things, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure having you join us on the show. And today we want to start, as always, with some of our cash and futures markets in the past week or so. So any movement that we've seen in those markets?
Sure. As I look at it, I would call this last week a pretty classic example of the market really catching a breather a little bit and just kind of reflecting on where we've gone the last couple of weeks and really the momentum we've seen in the cattle markets. So it's given us some staying power here. But, as we look at the futures trade, we were slightly up between, 80 cents and a little over $1 for the week's trade. Cash prices, have been a bit uneven. I think they've been pretty steady to maybe a little bit stronger. But again, we've kind of just held the levels that we gained really the last couple of weeks. Where we've seen the biggest action, I think, in the cattle complex is when we look at feeder cattle. So feeder cattle were up notably about $5 a hundredweight as we look at the futures prices. I would contribute a lot of that to the corn market. We've seen weakening in the corn market, which obviously spilled over looking at strength in feeder cattle. But also I think the feeder cattle market catching up to fed cattle. As we look at the strength of those fed cattle numbers has pulled up the feeder cattle prices. Also, I look at the box beef values. We did see some strength in that over the last week. I think I reminded our listeners that the last time I was on that box beef values typically lag the cash rally that we've seen. So I would contribute some of the strength in the box beef prices to the strength in the cattle prices we've seen over the last couple of weeks. We are at a record level for this time of year for the box beef values. I think that bodes well for prices going forward and really supporting that market. Hopefully hold up the cash market for fed cattle. Now, importantly, we're going to enter a really sweet spot period as we look between Mother's Day and Father's Day. This is really peak demand, so I think this will give us a real good temperature or barometer for where demand's going to be this year and how high we can maybe push those box beef values.
Absolutely. Yeah. As things are starting to warm up here, of course, that demand is starting to ramp up as well. And I think more so of like July, June is the hottest times of year. But like you said, those Mother's and Father's Day holidays, also a busy time of year.
It is. And I think I'm glad you mentioned that because it reminded me, as I look at the futures price for live cattle here in April, we ended Friday at 173, almost 174. But as you look at the June contract, it's about $10 per hundredweight lower at 164 and a half or so. So we're looking at a very wide spread there that we typically see somewhat of a spread, but that's pretty large for this time of year. And as we look at those prices, I would fully expect some convergence in that, meaning I think we're going to see the June prices strengthen a bit here. The question may be is, have we put in the spring high? Or maybe the summer low at this point. So I think, there is potential where we're going to see demand really hopefully remain strong. We're going to see some larger supplies coming on the market. I think that could pressure us a little bit. But overall, supplies are still pretty tight. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Important to keep watching our slaughter levels to see how that's bearing out. But overall, we're pretty current in this fed cattle market. So pointing to a lot of optimism here.
We always like to discuss some of the latest reports that have come out in the last week or so, and we recently received the most recent cattle on feed report. So was there anything there worth mentioning today?
A lot as of expected. We did see cattle on feed numbers as of April 1. We're down 4.4% compared to April 1 of last year. Pretty in line with pre-report expectations. A bit of a surprise where the placement numbers were a bit larger than pre-report expectations, but they were down slightly compared to a year ago levels. I think that made a lot of sense as we looked at some of the data. We've seen pretty strong receipts this last month, and so I think a lot of indication that placements remain strong. We got to give credit where credit's due. When you look at the marketing numbers, pre-report analysts got it right on the mark. It was down 1.1% compared to a year ago level. So, I wouldn't expect this to really be a huge impact on the market, as a lot of this was, I think, already embedded in what prices we're seeing for futures. More of a confirmation. As I look at the cattle on feed numbers, the one statistic of note this last quarter was they released the percentage or the number of heifers on feed, the number of steers on feed, and the total number. So we could calculate the percentage of heifers as a percentage of the total. Why that's notable, that kind of gives us an indication of possible expansion or as we might be entering that period. Latest numbers indicate we're nowhere near that. It's actually the highest percentage of heifers we've had on feed in 1,000+ head capacity feedlots. You got to go all the way back to 2001. So we're still seeing very high numbers of heifers. That's mitigating the impact on feedlot supplies, but showing us that, we're not seeing expansion anywhere near on the horizon.
Sure. Yeah, that is important to note for sure. I also thought it would be worth mentioning another report that was released, and the USDA last Wednesday actually released the 2022 total slaughter numbers. So when we think about that kind of puts into perspective what last year held and kind of what set up this year, right?
Certainly. And I think, the report we're talking about is the Livestock Slaughter Annual Summary. There's a lot of detail in that report. When we're summing up the totals of slaughter, we can break it down by class of cattle, steers and heifers and cows, and really gives us a lot of data to dig into. The one thing I wanted to highlight today quickly is in that report, they released the number of federally inspected cattle slaughter pens. They also do it for hogs and a few other species, but we're talking about cattle here. Why that's notable is we can kind of compare any changes in the number of those beef packers and the sizes of those packers, because they break it down by categories. What's notable is over the last year, so from 21 to 22, the industry added 47 packers. Now, they were in the small category, so it would be packers that slaughter between 1 and 999 head per year, and packers that slaughter 1,000 to 10,000 head per year. Those are very small packers, right? We're talking roughly 1 head a day to 8 head a day in that size category. But that's been what's a lot of it been talked about. The administration has had a strong interest in adding small and medium-sized packers to the industry. There's been a lot of investment, a lot of grant and dollars and subsidy dollars going to that sector. We're seeing some of that come to fruition, I think, as we're seeing increases in those numbers. We've overall added 50, so you can see that, all that additions have been in that category. One thing I'll end with this data is just to remind us that, those small and medium-sized packers, so packers that do 10,000 or less head per year, they account for roughly 2% of the cattle that are being slaughtered. There is 12 packers that slaughter 1 million head per year or more. That's roughly equates to about 5,000 head per day. And they slaughter 50% of the cattle. So it really shows you the dispersion across the industry, but also really the abilities of scale. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that, the reason we're seeing currency in the market is really operation across packing plants, and the ability to operate the largest packing plants shows you, the ability to work through the cattle. Also to note that those percentages, we're seeing the same percentage of cattle slaughtered through those largest plants that we did back in 1998. So, those levels haven't really changed over the last 20 plus years as we think about the size of the packers and the throughput through those packing plants.
Sure. So that just kind of puts into perspective the different roles of some of these packing capacities that we do see in the U.S. right now.
And I think it's important to highlight every size packer has a role in this industry. It's definitely about delivering product to consumers that consumers are demanding, right, and desiring. So, I think that's really important to understand that they all have a role. But some of those roles are a little bit different when we think about, producing the large size of production that we do in the United States.
Absolutely. And obviously those programs successful, like you said, in the last year or so, I guess since the pandemic, really, there's been that huge push for more of those smaller processors kind of support that area a bit more, right?
Well, I think, as I highlighted, I think they all serve a bit of a different role. I think it is important for consumers and producers that are interested in marketing, more locally products. Having a packer available is very important. But when we think about the large throughput of beef, cattle and beef production in the U.S., we need every size packer to do that. And when we look at the large packers, have a lot of that throughput through the production. So a lot of the research we've done post-pandemic and the disruptions shows that we have a very resilient beef industry and cattle and beef supply chain, and maybe some of the changes that are being made just need to be tweaks on the margin, right? To understand, how we can, better, prepare for possible disruptions and be able to maybe withstand them a little bit quicker than we did historically, but realizing we still have a very resilient supply chain in place.
Absolutely. Well, Lee, I can't thank you enough for all the insight you provided today for our cattle market update this week. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me. We'll talk to you again soon.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz, again providing commentary for this week's cattle market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. Tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we're joined now by Ignacio Ciampitti. He is our K-State Farm Systems Specialist, and today he's joining us to talk about corn planting considerations for this year specifically. So, Ignacio, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
This year specifically, I think we're facing, quite a few challenges, and one of those is just a lack of moisture and the increase in growing degree days that we've already had, right?
Yeah, and it's a challenge that is coming connected to last year. So, when we look at all the last year and precipitation and saltwater content coming from last growing season to the carryover effect that we have from this year, the lack of sufficient snow in many sections, in many regions of the state, and then connecting now to this lack of rains that we usually are expecting to see a little much higher levels, during the springtime. So everything is kind of the perfect storm. And we are entering into many situations with planting with just minimum water, looking at many of the soil profile across different regions in the state. Mm-hmm. The challenge for many of the farmers is to think about this game of gambling. And it's truly a gamble in the sense of we are looking at weather forecasts, we're looking at weather conditions, and most of the forecasts are talking about changes during the mid-summer season, hopefully turning into something wet. And then when we are thinking about inputs and, for example, like seeding rate, one of the topics that we'll be discussing today in corn, the decision is to be taken now, when we are planting. Looking at the numbers from this week, we are closer to 20% of planting already done for corn. So most of this decision has been already taken by many farmers, and there are implications in many other sense. And we'll discuss a little bit on the implications, but one of the studies that we start working on was looking at, we are in this area of large amount of data, and then we're trying to think about how can we start using the information to help farmers to take decisions. And this, the idea of working with the probabilities. I know that many people doesn't like the term. It implies a little bit on the gamble. But what we are trying to change is from being this educative guess on taking the decision versus trying to inform the decision using data and using the agronomist experience on using that data. So we don't let the data speak by itself. I want to make an interpretation of that data. We have a small kind of a model that we're working with data sets on different planting density studies from the last 10 years in corn. And the main things that we start looking is how can we make predictions based on weather conditions too. Last year when we did this analysis before the growing season, if we show you the map from 2022, it was showing that our recommendation was for farmers to find ways to cut on seeing rates, because we were looking at the signal from the weather coming from summer, and it was closer to be really dry. That was the projection. Not sure how many of them really did that, but it was the year to think about cutting. No? And when we're talking about cutting, I will give you an example. I'm not talking about drastically cutting your seeing rates. There is a concept that we discussed many times that we say that is the confidence interval. So a confidence interval means how confident do you feel on the estimation, on a number. So if a farmer is saying, my seeing rate target is 24,000, we know that that confidence, that interval, it could be between maybe 27 and 21, which basically is telling to the farmer that there might be some years that by using 27,000, if he has good weather conditions, you might maximize your yields and your profits by just risking more. But then, as we were thinking about last year, we were the other extreme, the 21,000. And the 21,000 means that in a year that you think or expect, drier conditions and more problems coming from these erratic precipitations that hard to predict. And sometimes last year we have even the challenge of May that was a little bit cold. Most of the precipitation came during June. And then after that, I think that was last week of June or early July, that rain disappeared. And it's hard to make those predictions. From a weather standpoint, we can hardly predict what will happen next week. So imagine if you wanted to predict what will happen in July or August.
Sure.
But there are some signals on weather that can tell you that if you be below, close to the normal or above normal. And most of the signals were telling us sometimes, going below normal. And in that case, for example, if your target is 24,000 and if you cut to 21, what you will do, mainly by taking that decision, is you will use a strategy to be more conservative. Because what you are trying to do on that approach is you put less plants out there. They will compete, they will use resources, but they will go a little bit slower. And the key factor is if you put more plants and if you increase too much your densities, what you will do is, even if you go above the optimum, is that you will start competing. The plants will compete faster, they will use more resources. And guess which ones are the resources that those plants are going to use? Water and nitrogen. So, and imagine the situation that these plants are competing faster, they're using water faster, and they're getting into flowering, and the profile is completely dry. And we show in many situations that the plants are more stressed under any water condition deficiency around flowering time. So if you have a couple of days without rain, and if you are entering into this stage of flowering, when the plant is defining the final number of rains in corn, without really good water supply in the soil, you might lose 40 to 50% of your potential. Just in that week or 2 weeks around flowering, that's how important it is to get with a good water condition at flowering. And there is no magic, so we're not telling that we are making rain or we are creating water. It's just only by reducing your seeing rates, what you do is that you tend to delay the moment that the plant are using the available water in the soil. And then you might get to the point of flowering with a little bit more available because you are kind of avoiding using too much. And then those plants will still find water at flowering. If not, the opposite scenario is those plants are becoming extremely susceptible to the amount of water available. And unless you have some rain, at that moment, they are depending entirely to the external supply.
Yeah, really just the difference of 1,000 or so seeds here can really make or break your profits for a season, right?
Yeah, and in some situations, we're trying to emphasize that we're not talking about big changes, right? We're talking about, in many situations, between 3,000 or 4,000, economically speaking. So if you go to the profit side, you make some savings. Maybe in a large number of acres. Then you might say, yeah, I make some savings. But we're also talking on the point of trying to find that optimal for the environment. Because if you go too high, most likely you are penalizing on the yield side because you are basically calculating more plants for what you really have resources available. Our main point is not only on the profits, but also to understand that if you go a little bit lower, we're not talking about much lower, then you will get your plants to prepare them for a much better opportunity under worse conditions. Okay, and that's the overall concept. And for those farmers that are taking the decision today, you need to look at your soil moisture. How much rain you have in the last 3, 4, 5 months, and be realistic. I mean, simple as that. Yes, things can change very quickly. We are in Kansas. We already know that, right? We are going from one day that we have close to 90 degrees and then the next day is 50.
It's crazy.
Exactly. We are in this environment that is changing fast. And this could change. Today we are talking about dry conditions. In 2 or 3 weeks, we might be talking about excess of moisture. And most of that at this time of the year will be welcome. If you are in those environments where you start seeing that historically the last couple of months and then looking today you are dry, playing conservative is not a bad idea. For those that they cut seeing rates last year, you might need to think about going back to a little bit more normal, because if we have good conditions in the summer, then you will be penalized because you will be missing some of those bushels. And again, most of the water consumption, the high water consumption for corn, I mean, if we are planting around these dates, it will come mainly close to, the end of June, July, okay? So early season, that water consumption is very small. Those plants don't need that much water, but we will start seeing most of the stress conditions when we enter into June. And this is where the situation of the water stress can be even more complex if we're entering into June and we are dry and we don't have any much precipitation on the forecast. So a couple of things to start thinking, because the decision of plant density and target seeding rate needs to be done today, but needs to be done with some of the current knowledge.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, too, because like you said, none of us have a crystal ball to kind of anticipate that far out in terms of weather, what we can expect. But, with the switching of El Nino and La Nina and kind of in this in-between, It makes it difficult.
It makes it difficult, but for me, it's always like farmers are the experts. Mm-hmm. So I would say trust on your instinct. Use your judgment. Think about that if you are adjusting density because you are expecting or thinking on a lower target yield, also adjust the other inputs. Fertilizer is the same, so adjust your fertilizer to make sure that you are matching your inputs. This is a year that so far playing conservative might not be a bad idea. If we change to getting more rain and being more wet during the rest of the summer, potentially we will be seeing some of the benefits. I'm expecting to see more benefits for those that they kind of wait to plant. Those ones that they are planting a little bit closer to beginning of May, potentially will be seeing more of the benefits for change in weather. But I'm expecting that it will be very random. It will be a situation that, depending on where you get rain and what is your northeast versus southeast, it will be completely random. And this is one of the years that we hope things are changing. But so far, we need to just buckle up and then use our best judgment to think about basically how to adjust this relationship of resources that I have today, how the soil and the weather is coming in the next couple of weeks, and then thinking about my inputs,
Absolutely. Well, Ignacio, this has been great insight for those tuning in today, and thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for the time again.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Farm Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we are ending today's show with our wildlife segment for the week, where we're joined by K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. And today we're going to be talking about forest regeneration. So forest regeneration, not something you'd often think of here in Kansas, right?
At least in the western two-thirds of the state, it's not something that we think about all that often. But I saw a recent study that brought up some interesting things about the effects that deer can have on forests that we don't necessarily think about here a lot, but I thought it was important for us to think about.
The study took place in Wisconsin, right? Tell us a bit about the process for that.
So in the northeastern U.S. and Great Lakes region, there are lots of places where deer densities can get so high that deer actually browse so much of the understory that they create changes in the forest community, the habitat structure that's available, and then also the trees that regenerate and replace the existing trees in the forest.
So this study specifically, they had two groups going on. They had an area that was enclosed, so deer couldn't get to it, and then an area that was left open to where deer could come to it.
They did. So to test whether or not deer were affecting the replacement trees or the regeneration of sugar maple and different species of ash, they did some timber stand improvement practices, which that would be thinning, and then they built the exclosures in the forest in the areas that they treated. So they basically looked at whether or not excluding deer had an effect, but also looked at whether or not their timber stand improvement practices had an effect on the regenerating trees. What they found was a little counterintuitive based on a lot of the research that's been coming out of the Northeast and the Great Lakes, and that was that thinning was more important to which species of trees regenerated than the effects that the deer were having, even though the deer did a lot of browsing on the species that they were looking at.
So those species that were talked about in this study, like you said, sugar maples, ash trees, a bit different than what we would be looking at here in Kansas, right?
Yeah, they are. So typically when we're thinking about this sort of thing in Kansas, we're thinking about different species of oak trees, hickory trees, walnut trees, pecans. And the way that we can think about this applying in Kansas is not necessarily so much about deer having an effect on the regeneration of the forest, but the fact that timber, whether it's oak timber or hickory timber or ash trees or something like that, as it matures, the canopy starts to close up and we get less and less sunlight getting to the ground. That can lead to a transition where we lose our understory, and that understory is the food and cover for many of the wildlife species that are in the forest. The way we sort of combat that is to create openings. So if we thin, then we allow more sunlight to get to the ground. It becomes thick, becomes hard to walk through, and that provides the cover that's also food for many of the wildlife species in our forest in Kansas.
So this thinning process, extremely important in terms of maintaining forest health and avoiding that forest maturation like you were talking about.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Drew, when it comes to thinning, we talk about prescribed burns a lot, maybe not so thinning as much. So are there any weird perspectives when it comes to thinning?
Well, one of the interesting things about thinning timber is that in Kansas, we tend to think of trees as being either something that you absolutely don't want to have or as something that's very valuable. And in certain parts of the state, we think about oak trees as being too valuable to cut. One of the challenges with that is that if they become so dense that there's not sunlight getting to the ground, then all of the trees that are going to replace them end up being shade-tolerant species because our canopy's closed, there's no sunlight getting to the ground, and we've got green ash, elm, hackberry, and these sorts of species that are replacing the oaks and the hickories in that timber. So the reality is that even trees that are valuable like oak trees and hickory trees can become so dense that they need to be thinned. So it can be important to cruise through the timber, pay attention to which oak trees are producing the most acorns and those sorts of things. Select trees that are not good acorn producers for thinning so that we can get lots of sunlight to the ground and regenerate the trees that we want to be regenerating. The other thing that goes along with that is that if we don't have enough sunlight getting to the ground, we're not going to have very good fuel for prescribed fires in our forest, which is the other really important tool, so thinning and burning for managing our forests. So we need to have that sunlight for lots of different reasons.
Well, Drew, I can't thank you enough for bringing this topic of forest regeneration to everybody's mind today. I appreciate all the insight you've shared.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts joining us for this week's Wildlife segment. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.